Twixt Land and Sea by Joseph Conrad, Part 3 out of 5. Under God it did, he exclaimed fervently. It was by a special mercy, I firmly believe, that it stood some of those hurricane squalls. It was the setting of that sail which I began. God's own hand in it, he interrupted me. Nothing less could have done it. I don't mind telling you that I hardly dared give the order. It seemed impossible that we could touch anything without losing it, and then our last hope would have been gone. The terror of that gale was on him yet. I let him go on for a bit, then said, casually, as if returning to a minor subject, "You were very anxious to give up your mate to the shore people, I believe." He was, to the law. His obscure tenacity on that point had in it something incomprehensible and a little awful. Something, as it were, mystical, quite apart from his anxiety that he should not be suspected of countenancing any doings of that sort. 37 virtuous years at sea, of which over 20 of immaculate command, and the last 15 in the Sephora, seemed to have laid him under some pitiless obligation. "And you know," he went on, groping shamefacedly amongst his feelings, "I did not engage that young fellow. His people had some interest with my owners. I was in a way forced to take him on. He looked very smart, very gentlemanly, and all that. But, do you know, I never liked him somehow. I am a plain man. You see, he wasn't exactly the sort for the chief mate of a ship like the Sephora. I had become so connected in thoughts and impressions with the secret sharer of my cabin that I felt as if I, personally, were being given to understand that I, too, was not the sort that would have done for the chief mate of a ship like the Sephora. I had no doubt of it in my mind, not at all the style of man. You understand?" he insisted, superfluously, looking hard at me. I smiled urbanely. He seemed at a loss for a while. "I suppose I must report a suicide." "Beg pardon. Suicide? That's what I will have to write to my owners directly I get in." "Unless you manage to recover him before tomorrow," I assented, dispassionately. "I mean, alive." He mumbled something which I really did not catch, and I turned my ear to him in a puzzled manner. He fairly bawled. "The land, I say, the mainland is at least 7 miles off my anchorage." About that my lack of excitement, of curiosity, of surprise, of any sort of pronounced interest, began to arouse his distrust. But except for the felicitous pretense of deafness I had not tried to pretend anything. I had felt utterly incapable of playing the part of ignorance properly, and therefore was afraid to try. It is also certain that he had brought some ready-made suspicions with him, and that he viewed my politeness as a strange and unnatural phenomenon. And yet how else could I have received him, not heartily? That was impossible for psychological reasons, which I need not state here. My only object was to keep off his inquiries. Surlily, yes, but surliness might have provoked a point-blank question. From its novelty to him and from its nature, punctilious courtesy was the manner best calculated to restrain the man. But there was the danger of his breaking through my defense bluntly. I could not, I think, have met him by a direct lie, also for psychological, not moral reasons. If he had only known how afraid I was of his putting my feeling of identity with the other to the test, but strangely enough I thought of it only afterward. I believe that he was not a little disconcerted by the reverse side of that weird situation, by something in me that reminded him of the man he was seeking, suggested a mysterious similitude to the young fellow he had distrusted and disliked from the first. However that might have been, the silence was not very prolonged. He took another oblique step. I reckon I had no more than a 2-mile pull to your ship. Not a bit more, and quite enough, too, in this awful heat, I said. Another pause full of mistrust followed. Necessity, they say, is mother of invention, but fear, too, is not barren of ingenious suggestions. And I was afraid he would ask me point blank for news of my other self. Nice little saloon, isn't it? I remarked, as if noticing for the first time the way his eyes roamed from one closed door to the other. And very well fitted out too here, for instance, I continued, reaching over the back of my seat negligently and flinging the door open. Is my bathroom. He made an eager movement, but hardly gave it a glance. I got up, shut the door of the bathroom, and invited him to have a look round, as if I were very proud of my accommodation. He had to rise and be shown round, but he went through the business without any raptures whatever. And now we will have a look at my stateroom, I declared, in a voice as loud as I dared to make it, crossing the cabin to the starboard side with purposely heavy steps. He followed me in and gazed around. My intelligent double had vanished. I played my part. Very convenient, isn't it? Very nice. Very comf. He didn't finish, and went out brusquely as if to escape from some unrighteous wiles of mine. But it was not to be. I had been too frightened not to feel vengeful. I felt I had him on the run, and I meant to keep him on the run. My polite insistence must have had something menacing in it, because he gave in suddenly. And I did not let him off a single item: mate's room, pantry, storerooms, the very sail locker, which was also under the poop. He had to look into them all. When at last I showed him out on the quarter-deck, he drew a long, spiritless sigh, and mumbled dismally that he must really be going back to his ship now. I desired my mate, who had joined us, to see to the captain's boat. The man of whiskers gave a blast on the whistle, which he used to wear hanging round his neck, and yelled. Sephora's away. My double down there in my cabin must have heard, and certainly could not feel more relieved than I. 4 fellows came running out from somewhere forward and went over the side, while my own men, appearing on deck too, lined the rail. I escorted my visitor to the gangway ceremoniously, and nearly overdid it. He was a tenacious beast. On the very ladder he lingered, and in that unique, guiltily conscientious manner of sticking to the point. I say, you don't think that? I covered his voice loudly. Certainly not. I am delighted. Goodbye. I had an idea of what he meant to say, and just saved myself by the privilege of defective hearing. He was too shaken generally to insist, but my mate, close witness of that parting, looked mystified, and his face took on a thoughtful cast. As I did not want to appear as if I wished to avoid all communication with my officers, he had the opportunity to address me. "Seems a very nice man. His boat's crew told our chaps a very extraordinary story, if what I am told by the steward is true." "I suppose you had it from the captain, sir?" "Yes, I had a story from the captain." "A very horrible affair, isn't it, sir?" "It is. Beats all these tales we hear about murders in Yankee ships." "I don't think it beats them. I don't think it resembles them in the least." "Bless my soul, you don't say so. But of course I've no acquaintance whatever with American ships, not I. So I couldn't go against your knowledge. It's horrible enough for me. But the queerest part is that those fellows seemed to have some idea the man was hidden aboard here." "They had really? Did you ever hear of such a thing?" "Preposterous, isn't it? We were walking to and fro athwart the quarter-deck. No one of the crew forward could be seen. The day was Sunday, and the mate pursued. There was some little dispute about it. Our chaps took offence. As if we would harbour a thing like that, they said. Wouldn't you like to look for him in our coal hole, quite a tiff? But they made it up in the end. I suppose he did drown himself." "Don't you, sir?" "I don't suppose anything. You have no doubt in the matter, sir?" "None whatever. I left him suddenly. I felt I was producing a bad impression, but with my double down there it was most trying to be on deck. And it was almost as trying to be below. Altogether a nerve-trying situation. But, on the whole, I felt less torn in two when I was with him. There was no one in the whole ship whom I dared take into my confidence, since the hands had got to know his story. It would have been impossible to pass him off for anyone else. And an accidental discovery was to be dreaded now more than ever. The steward being engaged in laying the table for dinner, we could talk only with our eyes when I first went down. Later in the afternoon we had a cautious try at whispering. The Sunday quietness of the ship was against us, the stillness of air and water around her was against us. The elements, the men were against us, everything was against us in our secret partnership. Time itself for this could not go on forever. The very trust in Providence was, I suppose, denied to his guilt. Shall I confess that this thought cast me down very much? And as to the chapter of accidents which counts for so much in the book of success, I could only hope that it was closed, for what favorable accident could be expected? "Did you hear everything?" were my first words as soon as we took up our position side by side, leaning over my bed-place. He had, and the proof of it was his earnest whisper, "The man told you he hardly dared to give the order." I understood the reference to be to that saving foresail. Yes, he was afraid of it being lost in the setting. I assure you he never gave the order. He may think he did, but he never gave it. He stood there with me on the break of the poop after the maintopsail blew away, and whimpered about our last hope, positively whimpered about it and nothing else, and the night coming on. To hear one's skipper go on like that in such weather was enough to drive any fellow out of his mind. It worked me up into a sort of desperation. I just took it into my own hands and went away from him, boiling. But what's the use telling you, you know? Do you think that if I had not been pretty fierce with them, I should have got the men to do anything? Not it. The bosun perhaps. Perhaps it wasn't a heavy sea, it was a sea gone mad. I suppose the end of the world will be something like that. And a man may have the heart to see it coming once and be done with it, but to have to face it day after day, I don't blame anybody. I was precious little better than the rest. Only I was an officer of that old coal wagon anyhow. I quite understand. I conveyed that sincere assurance into his ear. He was out of breath with whispering. I could hear him pant slightly. It was all very simple. The same strung-up force which had given 24 men a chance, at least, for their lives, had, in a sort of recoil, crushed an unworthy mutinous existence. But I had no leisure to weigh the merits of the matter. Footsteps in the saloon. A heavy knock. "There's enough wind to get under way with, sir." Here was the call of a new claim upon my thoughts and even upon my feelings. "Turn the hands up," I cried through the door. "I will be on deck directly." I was going out to make the acquaintance of my ship. Before I left the cabin, our eyes met the eyes of the only two strangers on board. I pointed to the recessed part where the little camp stool awaited him, and laid my finger on my lips. He made a gesture somewhat vague, a little mysterious, accompanied by a faint smile as if of regret. This is not the place to enlarge upon the sensations of a man who feels, for the first time, a ship move under his feet to his own independent word. In my case they were not unalloyed. I was not wholly alone with my command, for there was that stranger in my cabin. Or rather, I was not completely and wholly with her. Part of me was absent. That mental feeling of being in two places at once affected me physically, as if the mood of secrecy had penetrated my very soul. Before an hour had elapsed since the ship had begun to move, having occasion to ask the mate, he stood by my side to take a compass bearing of the pagoda. I caught myself reaching up to his ear in whispers. I say I caught myself, but enough had escaped to startle the man. I can't describe it otherwise than by saying that he shied. A grave, preoccupied manner, as though he were in possession of some perplexing intelligence, did not leave him henceforth. A little later I moved away from the rail to look at the compass with such a stealthy gait that the helmsman noticed it, and I could not help noticing the unusual roundness of his eyes. These are trifling instances, though it's to no commander's advantage to be suspected of ludicrous eccentricities. But I was also more seriously affected. There are to a seaman certain words, gestures, that should in given conditions come as naturally, as instinctively as the winking of a menaced eye. A certain order should spring onto his lips without thinking. A certain sign should get itself made, so to speak, without reflection. But all unconscious alertness had abandoned me. I had to make an effort of will to recall myself back from the cabin to the conditions of the moment. I felt that I was appearing an irresolute commander to those people who were watching me more or less critically. And, besides, there were the scares. On the second day out, for instance, coming off the deck in the afternoon, I had straw slippers on my bare feet. I stopped at the open pantry door and spoke to the steward. He was doing something there with his back to me. At the sound of my voice, he nearly jumped out of his skin, as the saying is, and incidentally broke a cup. "What on earth's the matter with you?" I asked, astonished. He was extremely confused. "Beg your pardon, sir. I made sure you were in your cabin." "You see, I wasn't. No, sir. I could have sworn I had heard you moving in there not a moment ago." "It's most extraordinary. Very sorry, sir." I passed on with an inward shudder. I was so identified with my secret double that I did not even mention the fact in those scanty, fearful whispers we exchanged. I suppose he had made some slight noise of some kind or other. It would have been miraculous if he hadn't at one time or another. And yet, haggard as he appeared, he looked always perfectly self-controlled, more than calm, almost invulnerable. On my suggestion, he remained almost entirely in the bathroom, which, upon the whole, was the safest place. There could be really no shadow of an excuse for anyone ever wanting to go in there, once the steward had done with it. It was a very tiny place. Sometimes he reclined on the floor, his legs bent, his head sustained on one elbow. At others I would find him on the camp stool, sitting in his gray sleeping suit, and with his cropped dark hair like a patient, unmoved convict. At night I would smuggle him into my bed place, and we would whisper together, with the regular footfalls of the officer of the watch passing and repassing over our heads. It was an infinitely miserable time. It was lucky that some tins of fine preserves were stowed in a locker in my stateroom. Hard bread I could always get hold of, and so he lived on stewed chicken, pâté de foie gras, asparagus, cooked oysters, sardines, on all sorts of abominable sham delicacies out of tins. My early morning coffee he always drank, and it was all I dared do for him in that respect. Every day there was the horrible maneuvering to go through so that my room and then the bathroom should be done in the usual way. I came to hate the sight of the steward, to abhor the voice of that harmless man. I felt that it was he who would bring on the disaster of discovery. It hung like a sword over our heads. The fourth day out, I think we were then working down the east side of the Gulf of Siam. Tack for tack, in light winds and smooth water. The fourth day, I say, of this miserable juggling with the unavoidable. As we sat at our evening meal, that man, whose slightest movement I dreaded, after putting down the dishes, ran up on deck busily. This could not be dangerous. Presently he came down again, and then it appeared that he had remembered a coat of mine which I had thrown over a rail to dry after having been wetted in a shower which had passed over the ship in the afternoon. Sitting stolidly at the head of the table, I became terrified at the sight of the garment on his arm. Of course he made for my door. There was no time to lose. "Steward," I thundered. My nerves were so shaken that I could not govern my voice and conceal my agitation. This was the sort of thing that made my terrifically whiskered mate tap his forehead with his forefinger. I had detected him using that gesture while talking on deck with a confidential air to the carpenter. It was too far to hear a word, but I had no doubt that this pantomime could only refer to the strange new captain. "Yes, sir," the pale-faced steward turned resignedly to me. It was this maddening course of being shouted at, checked without rhyme or reason, arbitrarily chased out of my cabin, suddenly called into it, sent flying out of his pantry on incomprehensible errands, that accounted for the growing wretchedness of his expression. "Where are you going with that coat?" "To your room, sir." "Is there another shower coming?" "I am sure I don't know, sir." "Shall I go up again and see, sir?" "No, never mind." My object was attained, as of course my other self in there would have heard everything that passed. During this interlude my two officers never raised their eyes off their respective plates. But the lip of that confounded cub, the second mate, quivered visibly. I expected the steward to hook my coat on and come out at once. He was very slow about it, but I dominated my nervousness sufficiently not to shout after him. Suddenly I became aware, it could be heard plainly enough, that the fellow for some reason or other was opening the door of the bathroom. It was the end. The place was literally not big enough to swing a cat in. My voice died in my throat, and I went stony all over. I expected to hear a yell of surprise and terror, and made a movement, but had not the strength to get on my legs. Everything remained still. Had my second self taken the poor wretch by the throat? I don't know what I would have done next moment if I had not seen the steward come out of my room, close the door, and then stand quietly by the sideboard. Saved, I thought, but no, lost, gone. He was gone. I laid my knife and fork down and leaned back in my chair. My head swam. After a while, when sufficiently recovered to speak in a steady voice, I instructed my mate to put the ship round at 8 o'clock himself. "I want come on deck," I went on. "I think I will turn in, and unless the wind shifts I don't want to be disturbed before midnight. I feel a bit seedy. You did look middling bad a little while ago," the chief mate remarked without showing any great concern. They both went out, and I stared at the steward clearing the table. There was nothing to be read on that wretched man's face. But why did he avoid my eyes? I asked myself. "Steward." "Sir," startled as usual, "where did you hang up that coat?" "In the bathroom, sir." The usual anxious tone. "It's not quite dry yet, sir." For some time longer I sat in the cuddy. Had my double vanished as he had come? But of his coming there was an explanation, whereas his disappearance would be inexplicable. I went slowly into my dark room, shut the door, lighted the lamp, and for a time dared not turn round. When at last I did, I saw him standing bolt upright in the narrow recessed part. It would not be true to say I had a shock, but an irresistible doubt of his bodily existence flitted through my mind. Can it be, I asked myself, that he is not visible to other eyes than mine? It was like being haunted. Motionless, with a grave face, he raised his hands slightly at me in a gesture which meant clearly, heavens, what a narrow escape, narrow indeed. I think I had come creeping quietly as near insanity as any man who has not actually gone over the border. That gesture restrained me, so to speak. The mate with the terrific whiskers was now putting the ship on the other tack. In the moment of profound silence which follows upon the hands going to their stations, I heard on the poop his raised voice, "Hard alley," and the distant shout of the order repeated on the main deck. The sails, in that light breeze, made but a faint fluttering noise. It ceased. The ship was coming round slowly. I held my breath in the renewed stillness of expectation. One wouldn't have thought that there was a single living soul on her decks. A sudden brisk shout, "Mainsail haul," broke the spell, and in the noisy cries and rush overhead of the men running away with the main brace, we too, down in my cabin, came together in our usual position by the bed-place. He did not wait for my question. I heard him fumbling here and just managed to squat myself down in the bath. He whispered to me. The fellow only opened the door and put his arm in to hang the coat up. "All the same, I never thought of that," I whispered back, even more appalled than before at the closeness of the shave, and marveling at that something unyielding in his character which was carrying him through so finely. There was no agitation in his whisper. Whoever was being driven distracted, it was not he. He was sane, and the proof of his sanity was continued when he took up the whispering again. It would never do for me to come to life again. It was something that a ghost might have said. But what he was alluding to was his old captain's reluctant admission of the theory of suicide. It would obviously serve his turn if I had understood at all the view which seemed to govern the unalterable purpose of his action. "You must maroon me as soon as ever you can get amongst these islands off the Cambodge shore," he went on. "Maroon you? We are not living in a boy's adventure tale," I protested. His scornful whispering took me up. "We aren't indeed. There's nothing of a boy's tale in this. But there's nothing else for it. I want no more. You don't suppose I am afraid of what can be done to me, prison or gallows or whatever they may please. But you don't see me coming back to explain such things to an old fellow in a wig and 12 respectable tradesmen. Do you? What can they know whether I am guilty or not, or of what I am guilty, either? That's my affair. What does the Bible say? Driven off the face of the earth. Very well, I am off the face of the earth now. As I came at night, so I shall go." "Impossible," I murmured. "You can't. Not naked like a soul on the day of judgment." "I shall freeze on to this sleeping suit. The last day is not yet, and you have understood thoroughly." Didn't you? I felt suddenly ashamed of myself. I may say truly that I understood, and my hesitation in letting that man swim away from my ship's side had been a mere sham sentiment, a sort of cowardice. "It can't be done now till next night," I breathed out. The ship is on the offshore tack, and the wind may fail us. As long as I know that you understand, he whispered. But of course you do. It's a great satisfaction to have got somebody to understand. You seem to have been there on purpose. And in the same whisper, as if we two whenever we talked had to say things to each other which were not fit for the world to hear. He added, "It's very wonderful." We remained side by side talking in our secret way, but sometimes silent or just exchanging a whispered word or two at long intervals. And as usual he stared through the port. A breath of wind came now and again into our faces. The ship might have been moored in dock, so gently and on an even keel she slipped through the water, that did not murmur even at our passage. Shadowy and silent like a phantom sea, at midnight I went on deck, and to my mate's great surprise put the ship round on the other tack. His terrible whiskers flitted round me in silent criticism. I certainly should not have done it if it had been only a question of getting out of that sleepy gulf as quickly as possible. I believe he told the second mate, who relieved him, that it was a great want of judgment. The other only yawned. That intolerable cub shuffled about so sleepily and lolled against the rails in such a slack, improper fashion, that I came down on him sharply. "Aren't you properly awake yet?" "Yes, sir, I am awake." "Well, then, be good enough to hold yourself as if you were, and keep a lookout. If there's any current, we will be closing with some islands before daylight. The east side of the gulf is fringed with islands, some solitary, others in groups. On the blue background of the high coast they seem to float on silvery patches of calm water, arid and gray, or dark green and rounded like clumps of evergreen bushes, with the larger ones a mile or two long, showing the outlines of ridges, ribs of gray rock under the dank mantle of matted leafage. Unknown to trade, to travel, almost to geography, the manner of life they harbor is an unsolved secret. There must be villages, settlements of fishermen at least on the largest of them, and some communication with the world is probably kept up by native craft. But all that forenoon, as we headed for them, fanned along by the faintest of breezes, I saw no sign of man or canoe in the field of the telescope. I kept on pointing at the scattered group. At noon I gave no orders for a change of course, and the mate's whiskers became much concerned and seemed to be offering themselves unduly to my notice. At last I said, "I am going to stand right in, quite in as far as I can take her." The stare of extreme surprise imparted an air of ferocity also to his eyes, and he looked truly terrific for a moment. "We are not doing well in the middle of the Gulf," I continued casually. "I am going to look for the land breezes tonight." "Bless my soul, do you mean, sir, in the dark amongst the lot of all them islands and reefs and shoals?" "Well, if there are any regular land breezes at all on this coast, one must get close inshore to find them." "Mustn't one? Bless my soul!" he exclaimed again under his breath. All that afternoon he wore a dreamy, contemplative appearance which in him was a mark of perplexity. After dinner I went into my stateroom as if I meant to take some rest. There we two bent our dark heads over a half-unrolled chart lying on my bed. "There," I said, "it's got to be Koh-Ring. I've been looking at it ever since sunrise. It has got 2 hills and a low point. It must be inhabited. And on the coast opposite there is what looks like the mouth of a biggish river with some town, no doubt. Not far up. It's the best chance for you that I can see." "Anything, Koh-Ring let it be." He looked thoughtfully at the chart as if surveying chances and distances from a lofty height, and following with his eyes his own figure wandering on the blank land of Cochin China, and then passing off that piece of paper clean out of sight into uncharted regions. And it was as if the ship had 2 captains to plan her course for her. I had been so worried and restless running up and down that I had not had the patience to dress that day. I had remained in my sleeping suit, with straw slippers and a soft floppy hat. The closeness of the heat in the Gulf had been most oppressive, and the crew were used to see me wandering in that airy attire. "She will clear the south point as she heads now," I whispered into his ear. "Goodness only knows when, though, but certainly after dark. I will edge her into half a mile, as far as I may be able to judge in the dark." "Be careful," he murmured warningly, and I realized suddenly that all my future, the only future for which I was fit, would perhaps go irretrievably to pieces in any mishap to my first command. I could not stop a moment longer in the room. I motioned him to get out of sight and made my way on the poop. That unplayful cub had the watch. I walked up and down for a while thinking things out, then beckoned him over. "Send a couple of hands to open the 2 quarter-deck ports," I said mildly. He actually had the impudence, or else so forgot himself in his wonder at such an incomprehensible order, as to repeat, "Open the quarter-deck ports? What for, sir?" "The only reason you need concern yourself about is because I tell you to do so. Have them open wide and fastened properly." He reddened and went off, but I believe made some jeering remark to the carpenter as to the sensible practice of ventilating a ship's quarter-deck. I know he popped into the mate's cabin to impart the fact to him because the Whiskers came on deck, as it were by chance, and stole glances at me from below for signs of lunacy or drunkenness, I suppose. A little before supper, feeling more restless than ever, I rejoined for a moment my second self. And to find him sitting so quietly was surprising, like something against nature inhuman. I developed my plan in a hurried whisper. "I shall stand in as close as I dare and then put her round. I shall presently find means to smuggle you out of here into the sail locker, which communicates with the lobby. But there is an opening, a sort of square for hauling the sails out, which gives straight on the quarter-deck, and which is never closed in fine weather, so as to give air to the sails. When the ship's way is deadened in stays, and all the hands are aft at the main braces, you shall have a clear road to slip out and get overboard through the open quarter-deck port. I've had them both fastened up. Use a rope's end to lower yourself into the water so as to avoid a splash, you know. It could be heard, and cause some beastly complication. He kept silent for a while, then whispered, "I understand. I won't be there to see you go," I began with an effort. "The rest. I only hope I have understood, too. You have." From first to last, and for the first time, there seemed to be a faltering, something strained in his whisper. He caught hold of my arm, but the ringing of the supper bell made me start. He didn't, though. He only released his grip. After supper I didn't come below again till well past 8 o'clock. The faint, steady breeze was loaded with dew, and the wet, darkened sails held all there was of propelling power in it. The night, clear and starry, sparkled darkly, and the opaque, lightless patches shifting slowly against the low stars were the drifting islets. On the port bow there was a big one, more distant and shadowily imposing by the great space of sky it eclipsed. On opening the door, I had a back view of my very own self looking at a chart. He had come out of the recess and was standing near the table. "Quite dark enough," I whispered. He stepped back and leaned against my bed with a level, quiet glance. I sat on the couch. We had nothing to say to each other. Over our heads the officer of the watch moved here and there. Then I heard him move quickly. I knew what that meant. He was making for the companion, and presently his voice was outside my door. "We are drawing in pretty fast, sir. Land looks rather close." "Very well," I answered. "I am coming on deck directly." I waited till he was gone out of the cuddy, then rose. My double moved too. The time had come to exchange our last whispers, for neither of us was ever to hear each other's natural voice. "Look here." I opened a drawer and took out 3 sovereigns. "Take this anyhow. I've got 6 and I should give you the lot, only I must keep a little money to buy some fruit and vegetables for the crew from native boats as we go through Sunda Straits." He shook his head. "Take it," I urged him, whispering desperately. "No one can tell what." He smiled and slapped meaningly the only pocket of the sleeping jacket. It was not safe, certainly, but I produced a large old silk handkerchief of mine, and tying the 3 pieces of gold in a corner, pressed it on him. He was touched, I suppose, because he took it at last and tied it quickly round his waist under the jacket. On his bare skin, our eyes met. Several seconds elapsed, till, our glances still mingled, I extended my hand and turned the lamp out. Then I passed through the cuddy, leaving the door of my room wide open. Steward. He was still lingering in the pantry in the greatness of his zeal, giving a rub-up to a plated croûte stand the last thing before going to bed. Being careful not to wake up the mate, whose room was opposite, I spoke in an undertone. He looked round anxiously. "Sir, can you get me a little hot water from the galley?" "I am afraid, sir, the galley fire's been out for some time now." "Go and see." He fled up the stairs. "Now," I whispered loudly into the saloon, too loudly, perhaps, but I was afraid I couldn't make a sound. He was by my side in an instant. The double captain slipped past the stairs through a tiny dark passage. A sliding door, We were in the sail locker, scrambling on our knees over the sails. A sudden thought struck me. I saw myself wandering barefooted, bareheaded, the sun beating on my dark poll. I snatched off my floppy hat and tried hurriedly in the dark to ram it on my other self. He dodged and fended off silently. I wonder what he thought had come to me before he understood and suddenly desisted. Our hands met gropingly, lingered united in a steady, motionless clasp for a second. No word was breathed by either of us when they separated. I was standing quietly by the pantry door when the steward returned. "Sorry, sir, kettle barely warm. Shall I light the spirit lamp?" "Never mind." I came out on deck slowly. There could be no going back for him. After a moment I walked over to leeward, and my heart flew into my mouth at the nearness of the land on the bow. Under any other circumstances I would not have held on a minute longer. The second mate had followed me anxiously. I looked on till I felt I could command my voice. "She will weather," I said then in a quiet tone. "Are you going to try that, sir?" He stammered out incredulously. I took no notice of him and raised my tone just enough to be heard by the helmsman. "Keep her good full, sir." The wind fanned my cheek. The sails slept. The world was silent. The strain of watching the dark loom of the land grow bigger and denser was too much for me. I had shut my eyes because the ship must go closer. She must. The stillness was intolerable. Were we standing still? When I opened my eyes, the second view started my heart with a thump. The black southern hill of Koh-ring seemed to hang right over the ship like a towering fragment of the everlasting night. On that enormous mass of blackness there was not a gleam to be seen, not a sound to be heard. It was gliding irresistibly toward us and yet seemed already within reach of the hand. I saw the vague figures of the watch grouped in the waist, gazing in awed silence. "Are you going on, sir?" inquired an unsteady voice at my elbow. I ignored it. I had to go on, keep her full, don't check her way. "That won't do now," I said warningly. "I can't see the sails very well." The helmsman answered me in strange, quavering tones. Was she close enough? Already she was. I won't say in the shadow of the land, but in the very blackness of it. Already swallowed up as it were, gone too close to be recalled, gone from me altogether. "Give the mate a call," I said to the young man who stood at my elbow as still as death. "And turn all hands up." My tone had a borrowed loudness reverberated from the height of the land. Several voices cried out together, "We are all on deck, sir." And stillness again, with the great shadow gliding closer, towering higher, without a light, without a sound. Such a hush had fallen on the ship that she might have been a bark of the dead floating in slowly under the very gate of Erebus. "My God, where are we?" It was the mate moaning at my elbow. He was thunderstruck, and as it were deprived of the moral support of his whiskers. He clapped his hands and absolutely cried out, "Lost." "Be quiet," I said sternly. He lowered his tone. but I saw the shadowy gesture of his despair. "What are we doing here, looking for the land wind?" He made as if to tear his hair, and addressed me recklessly. "She will never get out. You have done it, sir. I knew it should end in something like this. She will never weather, and you are too close now to stay. She will drift ashore before she's round. Oh my God!" I caught his arm as he was raising it to batter his poor devoted head, and shook it violently. "Is she? Keep good full there. Good full, sir," cried the helmsman in a frightened, thin, childlike voice. I hadn't let go the mate's arm and went on shaking it. "Ready about, do you hear? You go forward, shake, and stop there, shake, and hold your noise, shake, and see these head sheets properly overhauled, shake. Shake, shake." And all the time I dared not look toward the land lest my heart should fail me. I released my grip at last, and he ran forward as if fleeing for dear life. I wondered what my double there in the sail locker thought of this commotion. He was able to hear everything, and perhaps he was able to understand why, on my conscience, it had to be thus close, no less. My first order hard alley re-echoed ominously under the towering shadow of Koh-ring as if I had shouted in a mountain gorge. And then I watched the land intently. No, I could not feel her, and my second self was making now ready to slip out and lower himself overboard. Perhaps he was gone already. The great black mass brooding over our very mastheads began to pivot away from the ship's side silently. And now I forgot the secret stranger ready to depart, and remembered only that I was a total stranger to the ship. I did not know her. Would she do it? How was she to be handled? I swung the mainyard and waited helplessly. With the black mass of Koh-ring like the gate of the everlasting night towering over her taffrail. What would she do now? Had she way on her yet? I stepped to the side swiftly, and on the shadowy water I could see nothing except a faint phosphorescent flash revealing the glassy smoothness of the sleeping surface. It was impossible to tell, and I had not learned yet the feel of my ship. Was she moving? What I needed was something easily seen, a piece of paper, which I could throw overboard and watch. I had nothing on me to run down for it. I didn't dare. There was no time. All at once my strained, yearning stare distinguished a white object floating within a yard of the ship's side. White on the black water. A phosphorescent flash passed under it. What was that thing? I recognized my own floppy hat. It must have fallen off his head, and he didn't bother. Now I had what I wanted, the saving mark for my eyes. But I hardly thought of my other self, now gone from the ship, to be hidden forever from all friendly faces. To be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth, with no brand of the curse on his sane forehead to stay a slaying hand. Too proud to explain, and I watched the hat, the expression of my sudden pity for his mere flesh. It had been meant to save his homeless head from the dangers of the sun. And now, behold, it was saving the ship by serving me for a mark to help out the ignorance of my strangeness. Ha! It was drifting forward, warning me just in time that the ship had gathered sternway. "Shift the helm," I said in a low voice to the seaman standing still like a statue. The man's eyes glistened wildly in the binnacle light as he jumped round to the other side and spun round the wheel. I walked to the break of the poop. On the overshadowed deck all hands stood by the fore braces waiting for my order. The stars ahead seemed to be gliding from right to left, and all was so still in the world that I heard the quiet remarches round, passed in a tone of intense relief between two seamen. "Let go and haul." The foreyards ran round with a great noise, amidst cheery cries. And now the frightful whiskers made themselves heard giving various orders. Already the ship was drawing ahead, and I was alone with her. Nothing, no one in the world should stand now between us, throwing a shadow on the way of silent knowledge and mute affection. The perfect communion of a seaman with his first command. Walking to the taffrail, I was in time to make out, on the very edge of a darkness thrown by a towering black mass like the very gateway of Erebus, yes, I was in time to catch an evanescent glimpse of my white hat left behind to mark the spot where the secret sharer of my cabin and of my thoughts, as though he were my second self, had lowered himself into the water to take his punishment, a free man, a proud swimmer striking out for a new destiny, Freya of the 7 Isles. Chapter I. One day, and that day was many years ago now, I received a long, chatty letter from one of my old chums and fellow wanderers in eastern waters. He was still out there, but settled down and middle-aged. I imagined him grown portly in figure and domestic in his habits. In short, overtaken by the fate common to all except to those who, being specially beloved by the gods, get knocked on the head early. The letter was of the reminiscent do you remember kind of wistful letter of backward glances. And, amongst other things, surely you remember old Nelson, he wrote. Remember old Nelson, certainly. And to begin with, his name was not Nelson. The Englishmen in the archipelago called him Nelson because it was more convenient, I suppose, and he never protested. It would have been mere pedantry. The true form of his name was Nielsen. He had come out east long before the advent of telegraph cables, had served English firms, had married an English girl, had been one of us for years, trading and sailing in all directions through the eastern archipelago, across and around, transversely, diagonally, perpendicularly, in semicircles and zigzags and figures of eights for years and years. There was no nook or cranny of these tropical waters that the enterprise of old Nelson or Nielsen had not penetrated in an eminently pacific way. His tracks, if plotted out, would have covered the map of the archipelago like a cobweb, all of it, with the sole exception of the Philippines. He would never approach that part, from a strange dread of Spaniards, or, to be exact, of the Spanish authorities. What he imagined they could do to him, it is impossible to say. Perhaps at some time in his life he had read some stories of the Inquisition. He was in general afraid of what he called authorities, not the English authorities, which he trusted and respected. But the other two of that part of the world. He was not so horrified at the Dutch as he was at the Spaniards. But he was even more mistrustful of them, very mistrustful indeed. The Dutch, in his view, were capable of playing any ugly trick on a man who had the misfortune to displease them. There were their laws and regulations, but they had no notion of fair play in applying them. It was really pitiable to see the anxious circumspection of his dealings with some official or other, and remember that this man had been known to stroll up to a village of cannibals in New Guinea in a quiet, fearless manner, and note that he was always fleshy all his life, and, if I may say so, an appetizing morsel on some matter of barter that did not amount perhaps to £50 in the end. Remember old Nelson. Rather, truly, none of us in my generation had known him in his active days. He was retired in our time. He had bought, or else leased, part of a small island from the Sultan of a little group called the Seven Isles, not far north from Bangka. It was, I suppose, a legitimate transaction, but I have no doubt that had he been an Englishman the Dutch would have discovered a reason to fire him out without ceremony. In this connection, the real form of his name stood him in good stead. In the character of an unassuming Dane whose conduct was most correct, they let him be. With all his money engaged in cultivation, he was naturally careful not to give even the shadow of offence, and it was mostly for prudential reasons of that sort that he did not look with a favourable eye on Jasper Allen. But of that later. Yes, one remembered well enough old Nelson's big, hospitable bungalow erected on a shelving point of land, his portly form costumed generally in a white shirt and trousers. He had a confirmed habit of taking off his alpaca jacket on the slightest provocation, his round blue eyes, his straggly, sandy white moustache sticking out always like the quills of the fretful porcupine, his propensity to sit down suddenly and fan himself with his hat. But there's no use concealing the fact that what one remembered really was his daughter, who at that time came out to live with him and be a sort of lady of the Isles. Freya Nelson or Nielsen was the kind of girl one remembers. The oval of her face was perfect, and within that fascinating frame the most happy disposition of line and feature, with an admirable complexion, gave an impression of health, strength, and what I might call unconscious self-confidence, a most pleasant and, as it were, whimsical determination. I will not compare her eyes to violets, because the real shade of their color was peculiar, not so dark and more lustrous. They were of the wide open kind, and looked at one frankly in every mood. I never did see the long dark eyelashes lowered. I dare say Jasper Allen did, being a privileged person, but I have no doubt that the expression must have been charming in a complex way. She could, Jasper told me once with a touchingly imbecile exultation, sit on her hair. I dare say. It was not for me to behold these wonders. I was content to admire the neat and becoming way she used to do it up so as not to conceal the good shape of her head. And this wealth of hair was so glossy that when the screens of the west veranda were down, making a pleasant twilight there, or in the shade of the grove of fruit trees near the house, it seemed to give out a golden light of its own. She dressed generally in a white frock, with a skirt of walking length, showing her neat, laced brown boots. If there was any color about her costume, it was just a bit of blue, perhaps. No exertion seemed to distress her. I have seen her land from the dinghy after a long pull in the sun. She rowed herself about a good deal with no quickened breath, and not a single hair out of its place. In the morning, when she came out on the veranda for the first look westward, Sumatra way over the sea, she seemed as fresh and sparkling as a dewdrop. But a dewdrop is evanescent, and there was nothing evanescent about Freya. I remember her round, solid arms with the fine wrists, and her broad, capable hands with tapering fingers. I don't know whether she was actually born at sea, but I do know that up to 12 years of age she sailed about with her parents in various ships. After old Nelson lost his wife, it became a matter of serious concern for him what to do with the girl. A kind lady in Singapore, touched by his dumb grief and deplorable perplexity, offered to take charge of Freya. This arrangement lasted some 6 years, during which old Nelson or Nielsen retired and established himself on his island. And then it was settled, the kind lady going away to Europe, that his daughter should join him. As the first and most important preparation for that event, the old fellow ordered from his Singapore agent a Stain and Ebhart's upright grand. I was then commanding a little steamer in the island trade, and it fell to my lot to take it out to him. So I know something of Freya's upright grand. We landed the enormous packing case with difficulty on a flat piece of rock amongst some bushes, nearly knocking the bottom out of one of my boats in the course of that nautical operation. Then, all my crew assisting, engineers and firemen included, by the exercise of much anxious ingenuity, and by means of rollers, levers, tackles, and inclined planes of soaked planks, toiling in the sun like ancient Egyptians at the building of a pyramid. We got it as far as the house, and up on to the edge of the west veranda, which was the actual drawing room of the bungalow. There, the case being ripped off cautiously, the beautiful rosewood monster stood revealed at last. In reverent excitement we coaxed it against the wall and drew the first free breath of the day. It was certainly the heaviest movable object on that islet since the creation of the world. The volume of sound it gave out in that bungalow, which acted as a sounding board, was really astonishing. It thundered sweetly right over the sea. Jasper Allen told me that early of a morning on the deck of the Benito, his wonderfully fast and pretty brig, he could hear Freya playing her scales quite distinctly. But the fellow always anchored foolishly close to the point, as I told him more than once. Of course, these seas are almost uniformly serene, and the Seven Isles is a particularly calm and cloudless spot as a rule. But still, now and again, an afternoon thunderstorm over Bangka, or even one of these vicious, thick squalls from the distant Sumatra coast, would make a sudden sally upon the group, enveloping it for a couple of hours in whirlwinds and bluish-black murk of a particularly sinister aspect. Then, with the lowered rattan screens rattling desperately in the wind and the bungalow shaking all over, Freya would sit down to the piano and play fierce Wagner music in the flicker of blinding flashes, with thunderbolts falling all round, enough to make your hair stand on end, and Jasper would remain stock still on the veranda, adoring the back view of her supple, swaying figure, the miraculous sheen of her fair head, the rapid hands on the keys, the white nape of her neck, while the brig, down at the point there, surged at her cables within 100 yards of nasty, shiny, black rock heads. Ugh! And this, if you please, for no reason but that, when he went on board at night and laid his head on the pillow, he should feel that he was as near as he could conveniently get to his Freya slumbering in the bungalow. Did you ever and mind? This brig was the home to be their home, the floating paradise which he was gradually fitting out like a yacht to sail his life blissfully away in with Freya. Imbecile, but the fellow was always taking chances. One day, I remember I watched with Freya on the veranda the brig approaching the point from the northward. I suppose Jasper made the girl out with his long glass. What does he do, instead of standing on for another mile and a half along the shoals, and then tacking for the anchorage in a proper and seamanlike manner? He spies a gap between two disgusting old jagged reefs, puts the helm down suddenly and shoots the brig through, with all her sails shaking and rattling, so that we could hear the racket on the veranda. I drew my breath through my teeth, I can tell you, and Freya swore. Yes, she clenched her capable fists and stamped with her pretty brown boot and said damn, then, looking at me with a little heightened color, not much, she remarked, I forgot you were there, and laughed, to be sure, to be sure. When Jasper was in sight she was not likely to remember that anybody else in the world was there. In my concern at this mad trick I couldn't help appealing to her sympathetic common sense. Isn't he a fool? I said with feeling. Perfect idiot, she agreed warmly, looking at me straight with her wide open, earnest eyes and the dimple of a smile on her cheek. And that, I pointed out to her, just to save 20 minutes or so in meeting you. We heard the anchor go down, and then she became very resolute and threatening. Wait a bit, I will teach him. She went into her own room and shut the door, leaving me alone on the veranda with my instructions. Long before the brig's sails were furled, Jasper came up 3 steps at a time, forgetting to say how d'ye do, and looking right and left eagerly. Where's Freya? Wasn't she here just now? When I explained to him that he was to be deprived of Miss Freya's presence for a whole hour just to teach him, he said I had put her up to it, no doubt, and that he feared he would have yet to shoot me some day. She and I were getting too thick together. Then he flung himself into a chair and tried to talk to me about his trip. But the funny thing was that the fellow actually suffered. I could see it. His voice failed him, and he sat there dumb, looking at the door with the face of a man in pain. Fact. And the next still funnier thing was that the girl calmly walked out of her room in less than 10 minutes. And then I left. I mean to say that I went away to seek old Nelson or Nielsen on the back veranda, which was his own special nook in the distribution of that house, with the kind purpose of engaging him in conversation, lest he should start roaming about and intrude unwittingly where he was not wanted just then. He knew that the brig had arrived, though he did not know that Jasper was already with his daughter. I suppose he didn't think it was possible in the time. A father naturally wouldn't. He suspected that Alan was sweet on his girl, the fowls of the air and the fishes of the sea. Most of the traders in the archipelago, and all sorts and conditions of men in the town of Singapore were aware of it. But he was not capable of appreciating how far the girl was gone on the fellow. He had an idea that Freya was too sensible to ever be gone on anybody, I mean to an unmanageable extent. No, it was not that which made him sit on the back veranda and worry himself in his unassuming manner during Jasper's visits. What he worried about were the Dutch authorities, for it is a fact that the Dutch looked askance at the doings of Jasper Alan, owner and master of the brig Benito. They considered him much too enterprising in his trading. I don't know that he ever did anything illegal, but it seems to me that his immense activity was repulsive to their stolid character and slow-going methods. Anyway, in old Nelson's opinion, the captain of the Benito was a smart sailor and a nice young man, but not a desirable acquaintance upon the whole. Somewhat compromising, you understand. On the other hand, he did not like to tell Jasper in so many words to keep away. Poor old Nelson himself was a nice fellow. I believe he would have shrunk from hurting the feelings even of a mop-headed cannibal. Unless, perhaps, under very strong provocation. I mean the feelings, not the bodies. As against spears, knives, hatchets, clubs, or arrows, old Nelson had proved himself capable of taking his own part. In every other respect he had a timorous soul, so he sat on the back veranda with a concerned expression, and whenever the voices of his daughter and Jasper Alan reached him, he would blow out his cheeks and let the air escape with a dismal sound. Like a much-tried man, naturally I derided his fears, which he, more or less, confided to me. He had a certain regard for my judgment, and a certain respect, not for my moral qualities, however, but for the good terms I was supposed to be on with the Dutch authorities. I knew for a fact that his greatest bugbear, the governor of Banco, a charming, peppery, hearty, retired rear admiral, had a distinct liking for him. This consoling assurance, which I used always to put forward, made old Nelson or Nielsen brighten up for a moment. In the end he would shake his head doubtfully, as much as to say that this was all very well, but that there were depths in the Dutch official nature which no one but himself had ever fathomed. Perfectly ridiculous. On this occasion I am speaking of, old Nelson was even fretty. For while I was trying to entertain him with a very funny and somewhat scandalous adventure which happened to a certain acquaintance of ours in Saigon, he exclaimed suddenly, "What the devil he wants to turn up here for?" Clearly he had not heard a word of the anecdote, and this annoyed me, because the anecdote was really good. I stared at him. "Come, come," I cried. "Don't you know what Jasper Alan is turning up here for?" This was the first open allusion I had ever made to the true state of affairs between Jasper and his daughter. He took it very calmly. "Oh, Freya is a sensible girl," he murmured absently, his mind's eye obviously fixed on the authorities. No, Freya was no fool. He was not concerned about that. He didn't mind it in the least. The fellow was just company for her, he amused the girl. Nothing more. When the perspicacious old chap left off mumbling, all was still in the house. The other two were amusing themselves very quietly, and no doubt very heartily. What more absorbing and less noisy amusement could they have found than to plan their future, side by side on the veranda? They must have been looking at the brig, the third party in that fascinating game. Without her there would have been no future. She was the fortune and the home, and the great free world for them. Who was it that likened a ship to a prison? May I be ignominiously hanged at a yardarm if that's true. The white sails of that craft were the white wings' pinions, I believe would be the more poetical style, well, the white pinions of their soaring love, soaring as regards Jasper. Freya, being a woman, kept a better hold of the mundane connections of this affair. But Jasper was elevated in the true sense of the word ever since the day when, after they had been gazing at the brig in one of those decisive silences that alone establish a perfect communion between creatures gifted with speech, he proposed that she should share the ownership of that treasure with him. Indeed, he presented the brig to her altogether, but then his heart was in the brig since the day he bought her in Manila from a certain middle-aged Peruvian, in a sober suit of black broadcloth, enigmatic and sententious, who, for all I know, might have stolen her on the South American coast, whence he said he had come over to the Philippines for family reasons. This for family reasons was distinctly good. No true caballero would care to push on inquiries after such a statement. Indeed, Jasper was quite the caballero. The brig herself was then all black and enigmatical, and very dirty. A tarnished gem of the sea, or, rather, a neglected work of art. For he must have been an artist, the obscure builder who had put her body together on lovely lines, out of the hardest tropical timber fastened with the purest copper. Goodness only knows in what part of the world she was built. Jasper himself had not been able to ascertain much of her history from his sententious, saturnine Peruvian, if the fellow was a Peruvian, and not the devil himself in disguise, as Jasper jocularly pretended to believe. My opinion is that she was old enough to have been one of the last pirates, a slaver perhaps, or else an opium clipper of the early days. If not an opium smuggler, however that may be, she was as sound as on the day she first took the water. Sailed like a witch, steered like a little boat, and, like some fair women of adventurous life famous in history, seemed to have the secret of perpetual youth, so that there was nothing unnatural in Jasper Allen treating her like a lover, and that treatment restored the luster of her beauty. He clothed her in many coats of the very best white paint, so skillfully, carefully, artistically put on and kept clean by his badgered crew of picked Malays, that no costly enamel such as jewelers use for their work could have looked better and felt smoother to the touch. A narrow gilt molding defined her elegant sheer as she sat on the water, eclipsing easily the professional good looks of any pleasure yacht that ever came to the East in those days. For myself, I must say I prefer a molding of deep crimson color on a white hull. It gives a stronger relief besides being less expensive, and I told Jasper so. But no, nothing less than the best gold leaf would do, because no decoration could be gorgeous enough for the future abode of his Freya. His feelings for the brig and for the girl were as indissolubly united in his heart as you may fuse two precious metals together in one crucible. And the flame was pretty hot, I can assure you. It induced in him a fierce inward restlessness both of activity and desire. Too fine in face, with a lateral wave in his chestnut hair, spare, long-limbed, with an eager glint in his steely eyes and quick, brusque movements, he made me think sometimes of a flashing sword blade perpetually leaping out of the scabbard. It was only when he was near the girl, when he had her there to look at, that this peculiarly tense attitude was replaced by a grave, devout watchfulness of her slightest movements and utterances. Her cool, resolute, capable, good-humored self-possession seemed to steady his heart. Was it the magic of her face, of her voice, of her glances which calmed him so? Yet these were the very things one must believe which had set his imagination ablaze if love begins in imagination. But I am no man to discuss such mysteries, and it strikes me that we have neglected poor old Nelson inflating his cheeks in a state of worry on the back veranda. I pointed out to him that, after all, Jasper was not a very frequent visitor. He and his brig worked hard all over the archipelago. But all old Nelson said, and he said it uneasily, was, I hope Heemskirk won't turn up here while the brig's about. Getting up a scare about Heemskirk now, Heemskirk. Really, one hadn't the patience. Chapter Roman 2. For, pray, who was Heemskirk? You shall see at once how unreasonable this dread of Heemskirk. Certainly, his nature was malevolent enough. That was obvious. Directly you heard him laugh. Nothing gives away more a man's secret disposition than the unguarded ring of his laugh. But, bless my soul, if we were to start at every evil guffaw like a hare at every sound, we shouldn't be fit for anything but the solitude of a desert or the seclusion of a hermitage, and even there we should have to put up with the unavoidable company of the devil. However, the devil is a considerable personage, who has known better days and has moved high up in the hierarchy of celestial host. But in the hierarchy of mere earthly Dutchmen, Heemskirk, whose early days could not have been very splendid, was merely a naval officer 40 years of age, of no particular connections or ability to boast of. He was commanding the Neptune, a little gunboat employed on dreary patrol duty up and down the archipelago. To look after the traders, not a very exalted position truly. I tell you, Just a common middle-aged lieutenant of some 25 years' service and sure to be retired before long, that's all. He never bothered his head very much as to what was going on in the Seven Isles group, till he learned from some talk in Mintok or Palembang, I suppose, that there was a pretty girl living there. Curiosity, I presume, caused him to go poking around that way, and then, after he had once seen Freya, he made a practice of calling at the group whenever he found himself within half a day's steaming from it. I don't mean to say that Heemskerk was a typical Dutch naval officer. I have seen enough of them not to fall into that absurd mistake. He had a big, clean-shaven face, great flat, brown cheeks, with a thin, hooked nose and a small, pursy mouth squeezed in between. There were a few silver threads in his black hair, and his unpleasant eyes were nearly black too. He had a surly way of casting side glances without moving his head, which was set low on a short, round neck. A thick, round trunk in a dark undress jacket with gold shoulder straps was sustained by a straddly pair of thick, round legs in white drill trousers. His round skull under a white cap looked as if it were immensely thick too, but there were brains enough in it to discover and take advantage maliciously of poor old Nelson's nervousness before everything that was invested with the merest shred of authority. Heemskerk would land on the point and perambulate silently every part of the plantation as if the whole place belonged to him. Before her went to the house. On the veranda he would take the best chair, and would stay for tiffin or dinner. Just simply stay on, without taking the trouble to invite himself by so much as a word. He ought to have been kicked, if only for his manner to Miss Freya. Had he been a naked savage, armed with spears and poisoned arrows, old Nelson or Nielsen would have gone for him with his bare fists. But these gold shoulder straps, Dutch shoulder straps at that, were enough to terrify the old fellow. So he let the beggar treat him with heavy contempt, devour his daughter with his eyes, and drink the best part of his little stock of wine. I saw something of this, and on one occasion I tried to pass a remark on the subject. It was pitiable to see the trouble in old Nelson's round eyes. At first he cried out that the lieutenant was a good friend of his, a very good fellow. I went on staring at him pretty hard, so that at last he faltered, and had to own that, of course, Heemskerk was not a very genial person outwardly. But, all the same at bottom, I haven't yet met a genial Dutchman out here, I interrupted. Geniality, after all, is not of much consequence, but don't you see? Nelson looked suddenly so frightened at what I was going to say that I hadn't the heart to go on. Of course, I was going to tell him that the fellow was after his girl. That just describes it exactly. What Heemskerk might have expected, or what he thought he could do, I don't know. For all I can tell, he might have imagined himself irresistible, or have taken Freya for what she was not, on account of her lively, assured, unconstrained manner. But there it is. He was after that girl. Nelson could see it well enough. Only he preferred to ignore it. He did not want to be told of it. "All I want is to live in peace and quietness with the Dutch authorities," he mumbled shamefacedly. He was incurable. I was sorry for him, and I really think Miss Freya was sorry for her father, too. She restrained herself for his sake, and as everything she did it simply, unaffectedly, and even good-humoredly. No small effort that, because in Heemskerk's attentions there was an insolent touch of scorn, hard to put up with. Dutchmen of that sort are overbearing to their inferiors, and that officer of the king looked upon old Nelson and Freya as quite beneath him in every way. I can't say I felt sorry for Freya. She was not the sort of girl to take anything tragically. One could feel for her and sympathize with her difficulty, but she seemed equal to any situation. It was rather admiration she extorted by her competent serenity. It was only when Jasper and Heemskerk were together at the bungalow, as it happened now and then, that she felt the strain. And even then it was not for everybody to see. My eyes alone could detect a faint shadow on the radiance of her personality. Once I could not help saying to her appreciatively, "Upon my word, you are wonderful." She let it pass with a faint smile. "The great thing is to prevent Jasper becoming unreasonable," she said, and I could see real concern lurking in the quiet depths of her frank eyes gazing straight at me. "You will help to keep him quiet, won't you?" "Of course we must keep him quiet," I declared, understanding very well the nature of her anxiety. "He's such a lunatic, too, when he's roused." "He is," she assented, in a soft tone, for it was our joke to speak of Jasper abusively. "But I have tamed him a bit. He's quite a good boy now." "He would squash Heemskerk like a blackbeetle all the same," I remarked. "Rather," she murmured. "And that wouldn't do," she added quickly. "Imagine the state poor papa would get into. Besides, I mean to be mistress of the dear brig and sail about these seas, not go off wandering 10,000 miles away from here." "The sooner you are on board to look after the man and the brig the better," I said seriously. "They need you to steady them both a bit. I don't think Jasper will ever get sobered down till he has carried you off from this island. You don't see him when he is away from you, as I do. He's in a state of perpetual elation which almost frightens me." At this she smiled again, and then looked serious, for it could not be unpleasant to her to be told of her power, and she had some sense of her responsibility. She slipped away from me suddenly, because Heemskerk, with old Nelson in attendance at his elbow, was coming up the steps of the veranda. Directly his head came above the level of the floor, his ill-natured black eyes shot glances here and there. "Where's your girl, Nelson?" he asked in a tone as if every soul in the world belonged to him. And then to me, "The goddess has flown, eh?" Nelson's Cove, as we used to call it, was crowded with shipping that day. There was first my steamer, then the Neptune gunboat further out, and the Benito brig, anchored as usual so close inshore that it looked as if, with a little skill and judgment, one could shy a hat from the veranda on to her scrupulously holystoned quarter-deck. Her brasses flashed like gold, her white body paint had a sheen like a satin robe. The rake of her varnished spars and the big yards, squared to a hair, gave her a sort of martial elegance. She was a beauty. No wonder that in possession of a craft like that and the promise of a girl like Freya, Jasper lived in a state of perpetual elation fit, perhaps, for the seventh heaven, but not exactly safe in a world like ours. I remarked politely to Heemskerk that, with 3 guests in the house, Miss Freya had no doubt domestic matters to attend to. I knew, of course, that she had gone to meet Jasper at a certain cleared spot on the banks of the only stream on Nelson's little island. The commander of the Neptune gave me a dubious black look, and began to make himself at home, flinging his thick, cylindrical carcass into a rocking chair, and unbuttoning his coat. Old Nelson sat down opposite him in a most unassuming manner, staring anxiously with his round eyes and fanning himself with his hat. I tried to make conversation to while the time away, not an easy task with a morose, enamored Dutchman constantly looking from one door to another and answering one's advances either with a jeer or a grunt. However, the evening passed off all right. Luckily, there is a degree of bliss too intense for elation. Jasper was quiet and concentrated silently in watching Freya. As we went on board our respective ships, I offered to give his brig a tow out next morning. I did it on purpose to get him away at the earliest possible moment. So in the first cold light of the dawn we passed by the gunboat lying black and still without a sound in her, at the mouth of the glassy cove. But with tropical swiftness the sun had climbed twice its diameter above the horizon before we had rounded the reef and got abreast of the point. On the biggest boulder there stood Freya all in white and, in her helmet, like a feminine and martial statue with a rosy face. As I could see very well with my glasses, she fluttered an expressive handkerchief, and Jasper, running up the main rigging of the white and warlike brig, waved his hat in response. Shortly afterwards we parted, I to the northward and Jasper heading east with a light wind on the quarter. For Banjarmasin and 2 other ports, I believe it was, that trip. This peaceful occasion was the last on which I saw all these people assembled together. The charmingly fresh and resolute Freya, the innocently round-eyed old Nelson, Jasper, keen, long-limbed, lean-faced, admirably self-contained, in his manner, because inconceivably happy under the eyes of his Freya. All 3 tall, fair, and blue-eyed in varied shades, and amongst them the swarthy, arrogant, black-haired Dutchman, shorter nearly by a head, and so much thicker than any of them that he seemed to be a creature capable of inflating itself, a grotesque specimen of mankind from some other planet. The contrast struck me all at once as we stood in the lighted veranda, after rising from the dinner table. I was fascinated by it for the rest of the evening, and I remember the impression of something funny and ill-omened at the same time in it to this day. Chapter Roman 3. A few weeks later, coming early one morning into Singapore, from a journey to the southward, I saw the brig lying at anchor in all her usual symmetry and splendor of aspect, as though she had been taken out of a glass case and put delicately into the water that very moment. She was well out in the roadstead, but I steamed in and took up my habitual berth close in front of the town. Before we had finished breakfast, a quartermaster came to tell me that Captain Allen's boat was coming our way. His smart gig dashed alongside, and in 2 bounds he was up our accommodation ladder and shaking me by the hand with his nervous grip, his eyes snapping inquisitively, for he supposed I had called at the Seven Isles group on my way. I reached into my pocket for a nicely folded little note, which he grabbed out of my hand without ceremony, and carried off on the bridge to read by himself. After a decent interval I followed him up there, and found him pacing to and fro, for the nature of his emotions made him restless even in his most thoughtful moments. He shook his head at me triumphantly. "Well, my dear boy," he said, "I shall be counting the days now." I understood what he meant. I knew that those young people had settled already on a runaway match without official preliminaries. This was really a logical decision. Old Nelson or Nielsen would never have agreed to give up Freya peaceably to this compromising Jasper. Heavens, what would the Dutch authorities say to such a match? It sounds too ridiculous for words. But there's nothing in the world more selfishly hard than a timorous man in a fright about his little estate, as old Nelson used to call it in apologetic accents. A heart permeated by a particular sort of funk is proof against sense, feeling, and ridicule. It's a flint. Jasper would have made his request all the same and then taken his own way. But it was Freya who decided that nothing should be said, on the ground that Papa would only worry himself to distraction. He was capable of making himself ill, and then she wouldn't have the heart to leave him. Here you have the sanity of feminine outlook, and the frankness of feminine reasoning. And for the rest, Miss Freya could read poor dear Papa in the way a woman reads a man, like an open book. His daughter once gone, old Nelson would not worry himself. He would raise a great outcry, and make no end of lamentable fuss, but that's not the same thing. The real agonies of indecision, the anguish of conflicting feelings, would be spared to him. And as he was too unassuming to rage, he would, after a period of lamentation, devote himself to his little estate, and to keeping on good terms with the authorities. Time would do the rest. And Freya thought she could afford to wait, while ruling over her own home in the beautiful brig and over the man who loved her. This was the life for her who had learned to walk on a ship's deck. She was a ship child, a sea girl if ever there was one. And of course she loved Jasper and trusted him, but there was a shade of anxiety in her pride. It is very fine and romantic to possess for your very own a finely tempered and trusty sword blade, but whether it is the best weapon to counter with the common cudgel play of fate, that's another question. She knew that she had the more substance of the two. You needn't try any cheap jokes. I am not talking of their weights. She was just a little anxious while he was away, and she had me who, being a tried confidant, took the liberty to whisper frequently, the sooner the better. But there was a peculiar vein of obstinacy in Miss Freya, and her reason for delay was characteristic. Not before my 21st birthday, so that there shall be no mistake in people's minds as to me being old enough to know what I am doing. Jasper's feelings were in such subjection that he had never even remonstrated against the decree. She was just splendid, whatever she did or said, and there was an end of it for him. I believe that he was subtle enough to be even flattered at bottom at times. And then to console him he had the brig, which seemed pervaded by the spirit of Freya, since whatever he did on board was always done under the supreme sanction of his love. Yes, I will soon begin to count the days, he repeated. 11 months more. I will have to crowd 3 trips into that. Mind you don't come to grief trying to do too much, I admonished him. But he dismissed my caution with a laugh and an elated gesture. Pooh! Nothing could happen to the brig, he cried, as if the flame of his heart could light up the dark nights of uncharted seas. And the image of Freya served for an unerring beacon amongst hidden shoals, as if the winds had to wait on his future. The stars fight for it in their courses, as if the magic of his passion had the power to float a ship on a drop of dew or sail her through the eye of a needle simply because it was her magnificent lot to be the servant of a love so full of grace as to make all the ways of the earth safe. Resplendent and easy, I suppose, I said, after he had finished laughing at my innocent enough remark. I suppose you will be off today. That was what he meant to do. He had not gone at daylight only because he expected me to come in. And only fancy what has happened yesterday, he went on. My mate left me suddenly, had to, and as there's nobody to be found at a short notice, I am going to take Schultz with me. The notorious Schultz, why don't you jump out of your skin? I tell you I went and unearthed Schultz late last evening. After no end of trouble. I am your man, Captain, he says, in that wonderful voice of his. But I am sorry to confess I have practically no clothes to my back. I have had to sell all my wardrobe to get a little food from day to day. What a voice that man has got! Talk about moving stones, but people seem to get used to it. I had never seen him before, and upon my word, I felt suddenly tears rising to my eyes. Luckily it was dusk. He was sitting very quiet under a tree in a native compound as thin as a lath, and when I peered down at him all he had on was an old cotton singlet and a pair of ragged pajamas. I bought him 6 white suits and 2 pairs of canvas shoes. Can't clear the ship without a mate. Must have somebody. I am going on shore presently to sign him on, and I shall take him with me as I go back on board to get under way. Now, I am a lunatic, am I not? Mad, of course. Come on, lay it on thick. Let yourself go. I like to see you get excited. He so evidently expected me to scold that I took especial pleasure in exaggerating the calmness of my attitude. The worst that can be brought up against Schultz, I began, folding my arms and speaking dispassionately, is an awkward habit of stealing the stores of every ship he has ever been in. He will do it. That's really all that's wrong. I don't credit absolutely that story Captain Robinson tells of Schultz conspiring in Chantavon with some ruffians in a Chinese junk to steal the anchor off the starboard bow of the Bohemian Girl schooner. Robinson's story is too ingenious altogether. That other tale of the engineers of the Nan-Shan finding Schultz at midnight in the engine room busy hammering at the brass bearings to carry them off for sale on shore seems to me more authentic. Apart from this little weakness, let me tell you that Schultz is a smarter sailor than many who never took a drop of drink in their lives, and perhaps no worse morally than some men you and I know who have never stolen the value of a penny. He may not be a desirable person to have on board one's ship, but since you have no choice, he may be made to do. I believe the important thing is to understand his psychology. Don't give him any money till you have done with him. Not a cent, if he begs ever so, for as sure as fate the moment you give him any money he will begin to steal. Just remember that. I enjoyed Jasper's incredulous surprise. The devil he will, he cried. What on earth for? Aren't you trying to pull my leg, old boy? No, I am not. You must understand Schultz's psychology. He's neither a loafer nor a cadger. He's not likely to wander about looking for somebody to stand him drinks. But suppose he goes on shore with $5, or 50 for that matter, in his pocket. After the third or fourth glass, he becomes fuddled and charitable. He either drops his money all over the place, or else distributes the lot around, gives it to any one who will take it. Then it occurs to him that the night is young yet, and that he may require a good many more drinks for himself and his friends before morning. So he starts off cheerfully for his ship. His legs never get affected, nor his head either, in the usual way. He gets aboard and simply grabs the first thing that seems to him suitable, the cabin lamp, a coil of rope, a bag of biscuits, a drum of oil, and converts it into money without thinking twice about it. This is the process and no other. You have only to look out that he doesn't get a start. That's all. Confound his psychology, muttered Jasper. But a man with a voice like his is fit to talk to the angels. Is he incurable, do you think? I said that I thought so. Nobody had prosecuted him yet, but no one would employ him any longer. His end would be, I feared, to starve in some hole or other. Ah, well, reflected Jasper, the Benito isn't trading to any ports of civilization. That will make it easier for him to keep straight. That was true. The brig's business was on uncivilized coasts, with obscure Rajas dwelling in nearly unknown bays, with native settlements up mysterious rivers opening their somber, forest-lined estuaries among a welter of pale green reefs and dazzling sand banks, in lonely straits of calm blue water all aglitter with sunshine. Alone, far from the beaten tracks, she glided, all white, round dark, frowning headlands, stole out, silent like a ghost. From behind points of land stretching out all black in the moonlight, or lay hove to, like a sleeping sea bird, under the shadow of some nameless mountain waiting for a signal. She would be glimpsed suddenly on misty, squally days, dashing disdainfully aside the short, aggressive waves of the Java Sea, or be seen far, far away, a tiny dazzling white speck flying across the brooding purple masses of thunderclouds piled up on the horizon. sometimes on the rare mail tracks, where civilization brushes against wild mystery, when the naive passengers crowding along the rail exclaimed, pointing at her with interest, "Oh, here's a yacht." The Dutch captain, with a hostile glance, would grunt contemptuously, "Yacht, no, that's only English, Jasper." "A peddler, a good seaman, you say," ejaculated Jasper, still in the matter of the hopeless Schultz with the wonderfully touching voice. "First rate. Ask any one. Quite worth having, only impossible," I declared. "He shall have his chance to reform in the brig," said Jasper, with a laugh. "There will be no temptations either to drink or steal where I am going to this time." I didn't press him for anything more definite on that point. In fact, intimate as we were, I had a pretty clear notion of the general run of his business. But as we are going ashore in his gig, he asked suddenly, "By the way, do you know where Heemskerk is?" I eyed him covertly, and was reassured. He had asked the question not as a lover, but as a trader. I told him that I had heard in Palembang that the Neptune was on duty down about Floors and Sumbawa. Quite out of his way, he expressed his satisfaction. "You know," he went on, "that fellow, when he gets on the Borneo coast, amuses himself by knocking down my beacons. I have had to put up a few to help me in and out of the rivers. Early this year a Celebes trader becalmed in a prow was watching him at it. He steamed the gunboat full tilt at two of them, one after another, smashing them to pieces, and then lowered a boat on purpose to pull out a third, which I had a lot of trouble 6 months ago to stick up in the middle of a mudflat for a tide mark. Did you ever hear of anything more provoking, eh? I wouldn't quarrel with the beggar," I observed casually, yet disliking that piece of news strongly. "It isn't worth while." "I quarrel," cried Jasper. "I don't want to quarrel. I don't want to hurt a single hair of his ugly head. My dear fellow, when I think of Freya's 21st birthday, all the world's my friend, Heemskerk included. It's a nasty, spiteful amusement, all the same. We parted rather hurriedly on the quay, each of us having his own pressing business to attend to. I would have been very much cut up had I known that this hurried grasp of the hand with so long, old boy. Good luck to you was the last of our partings. On his return to the Straits I was away, and he was gone again before I got back. He was trying to achieve 3 trips before Freya's 21st birthday. At Nelson's Cove I missed him again by only a couple of days. Freya and I talked of that lunatic and perfect idiot with great delight and infinite appreciation. She was very radiant, with a more pronounced gaiety, notwithstanding that she had just parted from Jasper. But this was to be their last separation. "Do get aboard as soon as you can, Miss Freya," I entreated. She looked me straight in the face, her color a little heightened, and with a sort of solemn ardor, if there was a little catch in her voice. The very next day, ah yes, the very next day after her 21st birthday. I was pleased at this hint of deep feeling. It was as if she had grown impatient at last of the self-imposed delay. I supposed that Jasper's recent visit had told heavily. "That's right," I said approvingly. "I shall be much easier in my mind when I know you have taken charge of that lunatic." "Don't you lose a minute. He, of course, will be on time unless heavens fall." "Yes, unless," she repeated in a thoughtful whisper, raising her eyes to the evening sky without a speck of cloud anywhere. Silent for a time, we let our eyes wander over the waters below, looking mysteriously still in the twilight, as if trustfully composed for a long, long dream in the warm, tropical night. And the peace all round us seemed without limits and without end. And then we began again to talk Jasper over in our usual strain. We agreed that he was too reckless in many ways. Luckily, the brig was equal to the situation. Nothing apparently was too much for her. A perfect darling of a ship, said Miss Freya. She and her father had spent an afternoon on board. Jasper had given them some tea. Papa was grumpy. I had a vision of old Nelson under the brig's snowy awnings, nursing his unassuming vexation, and fanning himself with his hat. A comedy father. As a new instance of Jasper's lunacy, I was told that he was distressed at his inability to have solid silver handles fitted to all the cabin doors. "As if I would have let him," commented Miss Freya, with amused indignation. Incidentally, I learned also that Schultz, the nautical kleptomaniac with the pathetic voice, was still hanging on to his job. With Miss Freya's approval, Jasper had confided to the lady of his heart his purpose of straightening out the fellow's psychology. Yes, indeed. All the world was his friend because it breathed the same air with Freya. Somehow or other, I brought Heemskerk's name into conversation, and, to my great surprise, startled Miss Freya. Her eyes expressed something like distress, while she bit her lip as if to contain an explosion of laughter. Oh, yes, Heemskerk was at the bungalow at the same time with Jasper, but he arrived the day after. He left the same day as the brig, but a few hours later. What a nuisance he must have been to you too, I said feelingly. Her eyes flashed at me a sort of frightened merriment, and suddenly she exploded into a clear burst of laughter. Ha ha ha! I echoed it heartily, but not with the game charming tone. Ha ha ha! Isn't he grotesque? Ha ha ha! And the ludicrousness of old Nelson's inanely fierce round eyes in association with his conciliatory manner to the lieutenant presenting itself, my mind brought on another fit. "He looks," I spluttered, "he looks ha 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 amongst you three." like an unhappy black beetle. Ha ha ha. She gave out another ringing peal, ran off into her own room, and slammed the door behind her, leaving me profoundly astounded. I stopped laughing at once. "What's the joke?" asked old Nelson's voice, halfway down the steps. He came up, sat down, and blew out his cheeks, looking inexpressibly fatuous. But I didn't want to laugh any more, and what on earth, I asked myself, have we been laughing at in this uncontrollable fashion? I felt suddenly depressed. Oh, yes, Freya had started it. The girl's overwrought, I thought, and really one couldn't wonder at it. I had no answer to old Nelson's question, but he was too aggrieved at Jasper's visit to think of anything else. He as good as asked me whether I wouldn't undertake to hint to Jasper that he was not wanted at the Seven Isles group. I declared that it was not necessary, from certain circumstances which had come to my knowledge lately. I had reason to think that he would not be much troubled by Jasper Allen in the future. He emitted an earnest "thank God," which nearly set me laughing again, but he did not brighten up proportionately. It seemed Heemskerk had taken special pains to make himself disagreeable. The lieutenant had frightened old Nelson very much by expressing a sinister wonder at the government permitting a white man to settle down in that part at all. "It is against our declared policy," he had remarked. He had also charged him with being in reality no better than an Englishman. He had even tried to pick a quarrel with him for not learning to speak Dutch. "I told him I was too old to learn now," sighed out old Nelson or Nielsen dismally. "He said I ought to have learned Dutch long before. I had been making my living in Dutch dependencies. It was disgraceful of me not to speak Dutch," he said. He was as savage with me as if I had been a Chinaman. It was plain he had been viciously badgered. He did not mention how many bottles of his best claret he had offered up on the altar of conciliation. It must have been a generous libation, but old Nelson or Nielsen was really hospitable. He didn't mind that, and I only regretted that this virtue should be lavished on the lieutenant commander of the Neptune. I longed to tell him that in all probability he would be relieved from Heemskerk's visitations also. I did not do so only from the fear absurd, I admit, of arousing some sort of suspicion in his mind. As if with this guileless comedy father such a thing were possible. Strangely enough, the last words on the subject of Heemskerk were spoken by Freya, and in that very sense. The lieutenant was turning up persistently in old Nelson's conversation at dinner. At last I muttered a half-audible "Damn the lieutenant." I could see that the girl was getting exasperated, too. "And he wasn't well at all, was he, Freya?" old Nelson went on moaning. "Perhaps it was that which made him so snappish, hey, Freya? He looked very bad when he left us so suddenly." "His liver must be in a bad state, too. Oh, he will end by getting over it," said Freya impatiently. "And do leave off worrying about him, Papa. Very likely you won't see much of him for a long time to come." The look she gave me in exchange for my discreet smile had no hidden mirth in it. Her eyes seemed hollowed, her face gone wan in a couple of hours. We had been laughing too much, overwrought by the approach of the decisive moment. After all, sincere, courageous, and self-reliant as she was, she must have felt both the passion and the compunction of her resolve. The very strength of love which had carried her up to that point must have put her under a great moral strain, in which there might have been a little simple remorse, too. For she was honest, and there, across the table, sat poor old Nelson or Nielsen staring at her, round-eyed and so pathetically comic in his fierce aspect as to touch the most lightsome heart. He retired early to his room to soothe himself for a night's rest by perusing his account books. We two remained on the veranda for another hour or so, but we exchanged only languid phrases on things without importance, as though we had been emotionally jaded by our long day's talk on the only momentous subject. And yet there was something she might have told a friend. But she didn't. We parted silently. She distrusted my masculine lack of common sense, perhaps. Oh, Freya! Going down the precipitous path to the landing stage, I was confronted in the shadows of boulders and bushes by a draped feminine figure whose appearance startled me at first. It glided into my way suddenly from behind a piece of rock. But in a moment it occurred to me that it could be no one else but Freya's maid, a half-caste Malacca Portuguese. One caught fleeting glimpses of her olive face and dazzling white teeth about the house. I had observed her at times from a distance as she sat within call under the shade of some fruit trees, brushing and plaiting her long raven locks. It seemed to be the principal occupation of her leisure hours. We had often exchanged nods and smiles and a few words, too. She was a pretty creature, and once I had watched her approvingly make funny and expressive grimaces behind Heemskerk's back. I understood from Jasper that she was in the secret, like a comedy camerista. She was to accompany Freya on her irregular way to matrimony and ever-after happiness. Why should she be roaming by night near the cove unless on some love affair of her own, I asked myself. But there was nobody suitable within the Seven Isles group, as far as I knew. It flashed upon me that it was myself she had been lying in wait for. She hesitated, muffled from head to foot, shadowy and bashful. I advanced another pace, and how I felt is nobody's business. "What is it?" I asked, very low. "Nobody knows I am here," she whispered. "And nobody can see us," I whispered back. The murmur of words I've been so frightened reached me. Just then, 40 feet above our head, from the yet lighted veranda, unexpected and startling, Freya's voice rang out in a clear, imperious call, "Antonia!" With a stifled exclamation, the hesitating girl vanished out of the path. A bush nearby rustled, then silence. I waited, wondering. The lights on the veranda went out. I waited a while longer, then continued down the path to my boat, wondering more than ever. I remember the occurrences of that visit especially, because this was the last time I saw the Nelson bungalow. On arriving at the Straits, I found cable messages, which made it necessary for me to throw up my employment at a moment's notice and go home at once. I had a desperate scramble to catch the mailboat which was due to leave next day, but I found time to write 2 short notes. One to Freya, the other to Jasper. Later on I wrote at length, this time to Alan alone. I got no answer. I hunted up then his brother, or, rather, half-brother, a solicitor in the city, a sallow, calm, little man who looked at me over his spectacles thoughtfully. Jasper was the only child of his father's second marriage, a transaction which had failed to commend itself to the first. Grown-up family. You haven't heard for ages, I repeated with secret annoyance. May I ask what for ages means in this connection? It means that I don't care whether I ever hear from him or not, retorted the little man of law, turning nasty suddenly. I could not blame Jasper for not wasting his time in correspondence with such an outrageous relative. But why didn't he write to me, a decent sort of friend, after all, enough of a friend to find for his silence the excuse of forgetfulness natural to a state of transcendental bliss? I waited indulgently, but nothing ever came, and the East seemed to drop out of my life without an echo, like a stone falling into a well of prodigious depth. Thanks for watching. This video book is provided by StreamBooks.